We have said many times before that you do not see the world as it is, you see the world as you are. You see the world as you are. We talk about this many times as the famous phrase, to the person who has a hammer, every problem is a nail. Right? I told you once I'm standing talking to a friend of mine, a man walks up to us, someone we recognize, but not necessarily close friends, and he said to us, you have the same mouth, same exact mouth. Strange thing to say to people, right? Same mouth. How's that? So what was his profession? What did he do for a living? Dentist. Spends his day looking at people's mouths. So he sees people based on their mouths. Make sense? Now here's the thing. When you want to be successful in any situation, it is critically important to be able to get a good take, an accurate picture of what's happening in that situation. Does that make sense? If it's not an accurate picture, you can't respond, you can't plan, you can't envision, because you don't know what's actually happening. Make sense? You don't want to plan for yesterday, you want to plan for today or for tomorrow. Make sense? You have to get a picture of what tomorrow is going to look like. What does today look like? If your vision is skewed because your glasses are fogged up, or because for whatever reason you're in a bad emotional state, then you see the world in a non-accurate way. In other words, you don't just see the world as you are in general, you see the world as you are and in the state that you're in, the emotional state. The last two times we spoke here, we spoke about how to change your emotional state. What I want to talk about now is I want to give you a bunch of proofs and examples about how people's perceptions were totally changed based on their emotional state. Okay? There's a bunch of examples here. I want to give you one example. There's many examples of this. We're going to go through one at a time. They're not necessarily connected. The only connection really is that someone's emotional state radically changed what they saw and what they perceived. Okay, so there's a famous verse that talks about in Shmos, it's the second of the 5 books of the Torah. It says that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, wanted to go into the tent of meeting. There was a special place where God manifested his presence. Of course, his presence is everywhere, but in a certain place, he makes it more felt. A certain place is called the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. So the verse says, V'lo yachal Moshe lavoy el Ohel Moed. Moshe could not come into this tent of meeting. Ki shachan alav he'anan, because the cloud was resting on top of this tent of meeting. The cloud usually represents the clouds of glory, some type of physical representation of God's presence. You with me so far? Okay? So now, he couldn't go in there because God was, so to speak, there was too much holiness in one place, too much kedusha, and as a result, he couldn't go in. That's the simple meaning. But you can also understand it in a different way. The concept of joy, of simcha, of happiness, of a feeling of wholeness comes from when you have everything that you need, when you're fulfilled, not just physically but emotionally. If you're hungry, it's harder to feel that sense of happiness. If you're cold, tired, if you're scared, worried, nervous, concerned, overburdened, any of those areas, it's hard to feel the sense of simcha, of joy, when you have those emotions, right? What happens when you're worried? Maybe something's going to happen. But if someone can reassure you because they can give you physical protection, financial reassurance, emotional reassurance, what happens? The worry disappears. You feel the sense of simcha returns. So simcha comes from, joy comes from shleimus, being whole. If God is the ultimate in shleimus, the ultimate in completion, the ultimate in perfection, then all the joy in the world is rooted in God. In shleimus, he's whole, he's perfect. Now, God says, I'd love people to enjoy my perfection. Not perfection in this sense. I mean, perfection means balance. It means beauty. It means the ability to give. I'd love people to appreciate that, but if they're in a bad emotional state, I'm all about simcha and joy. They can't appreciate me. They're not going to see, they can't be near me. The closeness is impossible. It's impossible if you're in a bad emotional state. Which is better, to be in a great mood in a lousy restaurant someplace with some of your best friends, or to be in a beautiful place, on the beach someplace, blue waters, tropical waters, right? You can see the bottom of the sand through the water, beautiful, right? But you're in a bad mood.
Good mood
I'd say a good mood in a bad restaurant, right? Now you could say, right, a good mood in a bad restaurant, right? If you're in a terrible mood, it doesn't make a difference how beautiful the surroundings are. You don't see it, you're not really there. Does that make sense? Sometimes you have the best time with your friends waiting for the plane to take off, right? You're sitting there waiting for the plane, you have 2 hours to kill, great time to spend, beautiful, because you're in a good emotional state. Other times you get everything you want, it just doesn't count. Good, now, here's what happened. It says, Moshe Rabbeinu Moses couldn't go into the tent, ki shachan alav anan, because there was dwelling on him, or it, a cloud. One way is the cloud was on the tent. But the other way is that the cloud was on him. It was on Moses. He had some type, whatever reason is, which is not our topic right now, he had some type of emotional block. He felt bad. Because he felt bad, he couldn't go into the place where there was a manifestation of God. He said, I can't connect to God now, I feel terrible. Now, you can connect, of course, even when you feel terrible. But a high level of connection is going to be limited. You can go as, please give me something I need, but you can't relate in a positive way if you're in a bad emotional state. That's one example. Now, another example. This is a very interesting example. When the Jewish people were going into the land of Israel, Eretz Canaan, land of Israel, before they took over, so they sent spies. And the spies were meant to check the place out and see what's the best way to approach, et cetera, et cetera. The spies came back and had a very negative report of the land. It was a non-accurate negative report, but they were a negative report. One of the things they said is the people there were giants. And that was true. Objectively speaking, the people there were actually physically much bigger than the Jewish people at that point. There were actually giants there. It's not a normal situation they have these days. You don't have that. The reality has radically changed. Many ways it's changed. But that's one of the ways. So listen to this. The verse describes their report. It says the following: V'sham ra'inu es anafilim. We saw these giants, etc., etc., etc. Right? V'anahi be'einenu kachagavim. We were tiny in their eyes. V'chein hayinu be'eineihem. I'm sorry. We were tiny in our eyes, and so too we were small in their eyes. We were tiny in our eyes, and we were tiny in their eyes.
So when we view ourselves, other people will view us.
Exactly. The way you view yourself is the way other people view you. If you walk in and say, hi, I'm Rabbi Altman, and today I want to talk about changing your state and really being successful. And in the next 5 hours and the 5 days that we talk about in the seminar, we're going to be really excited. It's just going to give you tools to keep you at your maximum. So that's not going to help anybody, right? If you see yourself as, I just can't do it, yeah. Now, you can't make up potential. But if you want to maximize your potential, you have to be in a state where you believe that you can achieve it. You cannot achieve beyond what you believe. If you don't believe it, you can't do it. There's a cap. It's called the law of the lid. You cannot achieve beyond what you believe you can. It's always like that. Sometimes it's the other way around. They can because they think they can. Now, if I believe that I can fly across that valley, it's not going to happen. But if I want to maximize what I can do, I should believe that I can. Think, feel that I can. Okay? That's the case here. And they were faulted for this. They said, you were small compared to them, that's true. But there are miraculous situations that go on that can prevent you from being small in their eyes. Some small people are very powerful. Some people are very powerful and they make themselves small and they make themselves weak. Fine. Furthermore, another example. This is an amazing example. It's very simple. At a certain point, Hagar and Ishmael, Hagar and Ishmael, I don't know, Ishmael? I don't know if in English. Ishmael? Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar and Ishmael. They were wandering around, the mother and son. Son was 13 years old. He was sick. They were wandering in the desert. They were afraid they were going to die. A sick person usually, depends on this particular sickness, he drank tons of liquid. So they ran out of water. And now, Hagar was afraid that her son Ishmael was going to die. So she couldn't take it. She puts her son off in a distance underneath a tree so that, let me not see him die. He's about to die right now. I can't take it. I just can't take it. Right? And she sits down and she cries and she prays. Now, Ishmael was also crying and praying at that point because he wanted to survive. The verses describe what happens. Again, this is miraculous. This is not the normal state of affairs, but this is a miraculous event. What happens? God shows up again, I'm picking the miraculous ones, right? Obviously, right? God shows up in this situation and says, hey, look, there's a spring of water for you to drink. Now, the way it's described is, interesting way it's described as God uncovered her eyes and she saw a spring. That means that the spring was there all the time. She just didn't see it. Now, we've talked about this again many times before, but just it applies again. Sometimes when you're convinced that something's not going to happen, it doesn't happen. I'll give you another example and come back to this in a minute, right? Joseph, and his brothers. A whole discussion what happened over there. But at a certain point, his brothers decided that Yosef, is trying to take over and throw us all out. So they had to take drastic measures, and they decided to sell him to be an eved, a slave. Many years go by, they don't see him. In the meantime, Yosef, who they'd sold to be a slave, becomes the king, second in command of Egypt. He's standing before them many years later in regal robes, garments, extremely powerful man, running the country, effectively. Now, the brothers come before him, and they don't recognize him. Now, there's a lot of indications that he's actually Yosef, he's the brother. But it doesn't even occur to them that it's Yosef, because they believe that Yosef is a slave someplace. If he's even alive, he's in the dungeon or he's serving somebody. He's not the king of Egypt. So when they looked right at him, they didn't see it. Does that make sense? I told you a story many times. I applied for transfer from one university to another university. As I did not want to go to the second one, but one place I decided I wanted to apply to, I didn't really want to go there, was Yale University. So I applied to Yale University, and when you go to apply to any university, they send you either a rejection letter or an acceptance letter. So I finally got the rejection letter from Yale University. It was a tiny little letter. It was folded up about that size, right? And I thought, okay, great. So I take it out of the mailbox many years ago, and I put it, without opening it, into the garbage can. My mother is witnessing this scene, and she says to me, you know, you applied, you put all the effort in, why don't you open it up and read it? I said, Mom, come on. They don't send you, it's a rejection letter. They don't send you an acceptance letter, a tiny little envelope like this. They send you a whole packet. Everybody knows that. They still do that. So what's going on? Just do me a favor, open it up. I said, okay, open it, read it. Okay, I'll read it. Dear Mr. Altman, we're happy to tell you've been accepted to Yale University. So I said, you see, I got rejected, and I threw it in the garbage.
You got accepted.
Exactly. Now, the problem here is this. I was smart enough to apply. I was smart enough to get in, but I wasn't smart enough to read the words. Because you see the world as you are, not as it is. I decided I'm not in, so I read the words that you're accepted as you rejected. I read the words you're accepted, it still didn't register in your mind. Your mind doesn't want to make you a liar.
Wait, did you end up going to Yale?
No, thankfully. It's a great place, but it wasn't for me. Yes, I went someplace else. University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Now, here we go. Next thing. So here's what happens here. Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, she was in such a depressed state, she put her son far away from her so she shouldn't see her son die. She was feeling a terrible lack of hope. As a result of that, even though there was a spring, there was a possibility of solving the problem, she couldn't see it. She was incapable of seeing it. Does that make sense? So that's the same thing with us. When we're in situations in life, so many times, there's so many possibilities open to us, but because we're in a bad emotional state, we don't see them. So one of the things we have to do in general, besides use the tools that we talked about earlier, is to ask ourselves the following question. It's a very practical thing. Is it possible? Not is it probable, not is it likely, not is it definitely going to happen. Is it possible there's a solution here? Is it possible I could be successful? Is it possible I could learn this, overcome this problem, make enough money, fix this relationship, help this child, whatever it is? Get the job, whatever it is, whatever you're trying to do. Find the right person, whatever you're trying to do. If you don't ask it, they say, well, often it is possible. Once you say that it's possible, then the possibilities when they come up will be visible to you. If you don't say that it's possible, then they come and they go and you are blind to them. You don't see them. So many times that happens. I know two different couples are happily married for about 30 years. 30 years. Both of them, many couples, but these two particular couples, both of them were looking to get married, looking for the right one, and they both knew of each other. Each of the husband and wife knew of each other, but they said, nah, not him. No, not her. Both of them said, not him, not her. After several years of not him, not her, someone said, well, maybe it is him, maybe it is her, and they got married, lived happily ever after. Wow. Yeah? But they said, no, not him, not her. Can't be. Because you don't. Good. Now, another example. There's a verse that describes the Jewish people traveling through the wilderness. And it says that they were very thirsty, they were lacking water. Finally got to a certain place. The place is called Marim. The word Marim means bitterness. Why is it called bitterness? Because there were waters there, and they couldn't drink the waters. It says, Ki Marim Hema, because the waters were bitter. Marim Haim, they were bitter. Now in Hebrew, when you describe an object, you describe an object in masculine and feminine, just like French and Spanish, things like that. Yeah, masculine and feminine. So you say, they were bitter. So they were bitter could mean the waters were bitter, because the word water is a plural word. Waters were bitter. Or it could mean that the people themselves were bitter. When you're bitter and you taste something sweet, it doesn't taste good. If you're bitter and you taste bitter, then it tastes sweet. Make sense?
Negative plus negative.
Right. There's something that cancels out. That's right. I know someone actually whose father was, his uncle was very sick, and they could only eat food that was very, very badly burnt.
Because he's very, very badly burnt.
Because he was very badly, he had a bitterness, he had a sickness. The sickness was very bad for him, and he couldn't taste, his taste was thrown off. If the food was burnt, he could eat it. If it wasn't burnt, he couldn't eat it. Now.
You could eat my cookie.
Yeah, I think he was fine in the end, by the way, thank God, yeah? Now, watch this. What was the solution in this case? Moses took a tree and threw it. Moshe took a tree and threw it into the waters. Now, tree is not the sweetest thing in the world. That's a cinnamon tree, right? You ever take a bite out of a piece of bark?
Yum.
You know why you don't have bark tea? Because it's ich. That's why. That's a technical word. It's disgusting. It's bitter. But if you put something bitter in something that's sweet, it makes it bitter. And if you're bitter and it's bitter, then you can get something sweet out of it. The problem here is that they themselves were bitter. Now I want to tell you something. These words, kimarim hem, right? What does it mean they were bitter? So this is very interesting. These words, kimarim hem, which means they were bitter, equals ha-chosh-vim, those that think, the thinkers. The reason they were bitter is because of their mindset, of how they looked at the world. We talked about this earlier, of the meaning they gave the situation. That's why they were bitter. Ha-choshvim, the thinkers. It's the same exact, this is numerically the same. I'm not going to do the whole numerical value. Each letter in Hebrew has a numerical value. This is 20, this is 10, this is 40, this is 200, this is 10, this is 40. We're not going to do the whole calculation, but it's the same exact thing. Ha-choshvim, the thinkers, the thinkers. The reason they were bitter is because of their thoughts of how they were looking at the world. They didn't have to be. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, it says in the Talmud that a person who's rich is a person who rejoices with what he has. He says, this is what I have. Let me find something good in it. Let me see what's good about this. We talked about that last time. What are the questions you can ask yourself? It also means, it's the same numerical value, haser mimcha, remove from yourself. If you have this bitterness, because they're bitter, you keep saying, that has to be removed from you.
Can you write the English definition?
Yes. So kimarim he means because, that's because they were bitter. Because they were bitter. That's this. This ha-choshvim is the thinkers. Means they thought. And this haser mimcha is remove from yourself. There are certain things that essentially should be removed from your way of looking at the world. That is walking around saying, kimarim heim. These things are negative. This is bitter, it's bitter, everything's bitter. You see, you make the world the way it is. Good, now further.
See the world the way you see it.
You see the world the way you are, and you actually make the world the way you are. I said they say the world as is, right? You see the world as you are, that's right. Now, a few other things. It's very interesting here. Soon after this, they traveled, so they didn't have much water. Soon after, they traveled to a place called Elim. Elim is a place that had 70 date palms, 70 trees. Now, we're talking about several million people traveling. When they got to Elim, they were very happy. Why? Wow, date trees, we're going to have free dates. Now, dates are yummy, but how many dates will several million people eat? How many dates can be produced by 70 trees? It's not that much. Why were they so happy when they got there?
Because the way they thought.
That's exactly right. Because their emotional state changed, so now they got to a new situation, even though it was small, it wasn't a big deal, they felt happy about it. They saw the good in the situation. They saw that as an encouragement. It wasn't a big deal, but the encouragement was a big deal. Oh, God's with us. He's giving us some kind of little cherry on top. Now, if you're hungry, a cherry on top is not enough. But if it shows that at least someone's paying attention to me, I'm not alone, I'm not out there, that's a different story. Now, there's two reasons that you want to do this. You want to be able to master your emotional state. One reason is because you'll be a happier person, simply speaking, right? But I think the more important reason is that you'll be more effective, obviously, right? If you're in a bad emotional state, you can't see the possibilities. You don't use your own creativity. You don't use your own ability. You're functioning at 10% of what you can do. So when you want to make a decision, the first thing you have to say is, how do I put myself in a good emotional state so I can decide properly? A terrible example of this is Esav, translated as Esau. There was a certain day in his life where he decided to sell his right to be the firstborn. What day was that?
The day his brother made soup for his father.
That same true. Why was his brother making soup for his father? Because that was a meal of mourning, of Avelis, of mourning. Because their grandfather, Avram Avinu, Abraham, had just died. Now Esav was very close to his grandfather. Among other reasons, he's his grandfather. Yeah? And people had relationships then that were much closer than they are these days. Much closer. Yeah? Much more deep. But that's another story. When his grandfather died, he was completely bowled over. He was in a very bad emotional state. When you're in a bad emotional state, don't make big decisions. He decided to sell the right to be the firstborn on that day. He should have said, listen, I am not capable of making any decisions now. I'm emotionally drunk. I can't do it. I'm too upset. Let me calm down for a week and then we'll talk about it. Yeah? His brother was thinking very straight. His brother said, this is an opportunity to prevent a lot of problems in the future by having a person who's not trying to become better use the power of being the firstborn. I don't want him to abuse that power. He's abusing his power. So his brother grabbed the opportunity. In the Yiddish they say, chap rein, grabbed right in.
Didn't his brother deceive his father? And isn't that...
That's a whole discussion why that happened. That was divinely guided. He didn't want to do it. If you see the language that he uses, he says the word, maybe my father's going to find me. There's two words in Hebrew that say the word maybe. One of them is pen, which means I don't want it to happen. And the other word is ulai, I do want it to happen. He kept saying the words ulai. Maybe my father's going to find me. I so badly don't want to deceive my father. I want him to figure out that it's me and not the other one. He very much didn't want to do it. It's clear from so many things he didn't want to do it. Okay, now let's keep going. Great question. Here's an interesting thing. There's a famous old Yiddish story. A man says, Rabbi, I have a problem. Runs to the rabbi. What's the problem? He says, my son broke his leg. Isn't that terrible? So the rabbi says, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. So the man walks out of there like, my son broke his leg. It's terrible. He's in pain, right? Fine. A little bit later on, the man comes back and he says, Rabbi, it's so great that my son broke his leg because the government came and rounded up a bunch of young boys to take them and enlist them in the army to be in the army for the next 20 years. Force them to go into the army. Isn't it great he broke his leg? So the rabbi says, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. And the story goes on like this for a long time, right? You can't tell at the time when something's good and when something's bad. But what you can do is you can decide something beneficial is going to come out of this. Why? You can use it for something good. Or you can say, it doesn't matter if it's good or bad. If I believe that it's good, it puts me in a better emotional state to use all the resources I can to make the situation better. Does that make sense? If I'm depressed, if I'm thrown over, if I'm bowled over by my fear, then I can't function. It's okay to be afraid, but to allow fear to grab you by the tail and swing you around, oh, that's not okay. Make sense? Now watch this. One of the words for pleasure in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew is this word. Oneg. It's a little wild nun. An oneg. What's oneg? Oneg is pleasure. Oneg Shabbos, the same idea, right? Yeah? Is that what we said? Yeah? Oneg is pleasure. This word oneg. Now, the word oneg is usually spelled without a vav, so let's just spell it this way. Oneg. That's how it's spelled. Now, the word oneg means pleasure. What determines if you're having pleasure from something? The emotional meaning that you're giving it. The meaning that you're giving it. Sometimes if you know that something tastes good, but it's about to be bad, then you don't have any pleasure from it. Right? If your mommy says to you, I'll give you a yummy drink and then we're going to the dentist. You'd rather skip the drink and skip the dentist. No problem. Because that pleasure is going to lead to pain. The meaning that you give it, right? Other times it's a little bit painful, but you're happy. If you sit there quietly and don't complain, I'm going to give you a piece of cake. Great. You travel very far to get to a nice vacation spot. It could be a big hassle to travel. Very often it is. But you know the pain at the beginning is leading to pleasure in the end, so you're happy about the pain. Sometimes you pay the dentist to relieve you of your problem. Even though it hurts, you know it's the best thing. Okay, now, what's the difference between the word oneg and the word nega? The word nega is the same exact letters. Nega is nun, gimel, ayin. The word nega means, the word oneg means pleasure. And a nega means, I don't have a good word for this. If you guys can help me out, that would be wonderful. A nega is a boo-boo. It's a boo-boo. It's a wound. It's a wound. But it's not exactly a wound. It could be, a nega could be because of a skin condition. It's not a wound. It's some type of inflammation of the skin or the body. A nega is like a hit. I'm not sure there's a word for that. I don't know what the word is for it. Well, let's just call it a boo-boo, okay? You with me? A boo-boo. Maybe it's boo-boo, boo-dash-boo. I don't know how to spell that. Anyway, whatever it is, here's how it works. This is the same exact letters. The difference between an oneg, pleasure, and a boo-boo is what? Is where you put the ayin. The word ayin means eye. This letter ayin is what changes. It moves. The letter ayin also means eye. The way to say eye is ayin. If you change how you look at the pleasure, it can become pain. If you change how you look at the pain, it becomes pleasure. Now, it sounds cute, but it's not cute. There's a lot of examples that this is built into the fabric of reality. God made the language of Hebrew first, of Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, and then made the world with those words. Oneg and nega are very close. A lot of things in life situations are very, very close. A slight change in perspective could make it terrible or could make it wonderful. Now, I want to give you an example of that. There was a king, very famous king. Now, this king had a little issue. His name was Uzziah. He had a little issue. He got what's called saras, which is spiritual leprosy. If a person gets a certain outbreak on the skin, it's not because of a physical thing, it's because of a spiritual problem. He spoke Lashon Hara. Somehow, somebody spoke Lashon Hara, which is he slandered somebody else. And as a result, in those days, certain people, if they would speak Lashon Hara, they speak negatively about other people, they would have this outbreak on their skin. Whoever had that had to be removed from society. They had to leave from where people were. They had to go out into the wilderness and be by themselves. Now, for a king to have to do that is extremely embarrassing. When are you allowed to come back? When it goes away. When it goes away to a certain extent, you're allowed to come back. How long will that take? It could take a short amount of time. Could take a long time. They didn't know how long it's going to take. It's indefinite. Could take a week. Could take 2 weeks. You don't know. Now, when Uzziah was away, his son, Yosam, became the acting king. He wasn't actually king, but he became the acting king. Now listen to this. Put him on the side there for a second. We'll come back to the story in a minute. The Talmud says that there was one man that was so great, so high spiritually, so good, that with his merit alone, he could exempt everyone in his generation from any type of punishment for anything they'd ever done wrong. No, his name was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He wrote the Zohar. A very, very big man. They said about him that if you add the merit of his son, Elazar, who was also incredibly good, that the two of them could exempt every human being from the beginning of time till that moment from any punishment whatsoever. That's how great they were.
Why didn't you do that?
Wait a second. And if you add a third person, Yosam ben Uzziah, this prince, this man who was taking over for his father, then they could exempt everyone from the beginning of time till the end of time from any punishment. They didn't do that for various reasons. They weren't able to, but that's how great their merit was. It's just telling you how great they were. Now, that means that Yosam ben Uzziah, this prince, was of stellar proportions in the spiritual world. He was a tremendous person. Do you know anybody who's called Yosam? Yotam. Yotam. It happens, there are a few people, but it's not the super common name, it's less known. Why in the world was this man so great? So listen to this. His father developed a nega, a boo-boo of tsaras. His father developed this appearance of tsaras on his skin, and his father had to leave. And he sat in place of his father for 40 years. But he never sat on the throne. Now, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but the older a person gets, the more they want power and honor. Especially men. Women have it less, they have a different type of thing, slightly different, but especially power and honor. The older they get, they're not looking for physical drives, they're not looking for other things, they want power and honor. To be able to sit on the throne of the king and to be the king, that's a lot of power, a lot of honor. It was an incredible test for Yosem to say, I'm not the king, I'm just the acting king. So all the decrees he made for 40 years were made in his father's name. He never sat on the throne. He said, signed by my father, everything in his father's name. He never took credit himself. That was an incredible test that lasted for 40 years. Because of that test, he reached such a spiritual level that he joined these other two great men and was able to exempt everybody from all of time from any type of punishment whatsoever. That's how great he was. But here's the thing. It only came by means of the nega, of the pain of his father, the boo-boo, his father. Had there not been that embarrassment and that physical pain and that separation for 40 years, the son, Yosem, could never have reached that stellar level, could never have gotten to such a level. So the pain was cause for joy. If you looked at it after the fact, the nega became one of the greatest oneg's pleasures that there ever was. My son reached such a high level because I had this pain, he said. Now, you could either realize that at the beginning or realize it at the end. Everything's being orchestrated. It's an interesting thing. This is something that it's hard to see sometimes in short term. In long term, the older you get, the more you see that things that seemed to be terrible in the past were actually beneficial. Sometimes you don't see it for many, many years. That's another story. I want to give you an extreme example of many years. Now this is extreme, most cases you don't see this. Okay, this is an extreme example. At the beginning of time, there were a couple, yeah? Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. They had two children, simply speaking. Cain and Hevel, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel. According to the source that we have, that happened at the age of 50 days old. Now they were not babies. Again, reality was different. They matured physically very quickly. They were like men. But 50 days old, they hadn't yet gotten married and had children yet. That's a whole story. There were other people, but there were other people who were also, let's say there's possibilities of other people there. That's not our topic right now, how that was possible also. But let's say that at some point there were other people that were there. It wasn't their mother, it was other people also. But let's say whatever the case is, right? Now, so the mother, Chava, Eve, sees two children. One kills the other one. She doesn't know what to do with herself. Who knows what the pain is like? Then she looks forward. They lived a long time those days. Generations go by. They're still alive. And they see many people the earth was repopulated, right? And it was being populated the first time. And her son, meantime, just gets lost in history because her son, Abel, was killed. He never continued. Everyone else is continuing. The world's going on, but her son died. It was terrible. It's tragic, right? Not only that, the death was a terrible death. Since it was the first person who died in the world, when Cain killed Abel, he wasn't sure exactly where the soul is going to leave the body, so he hit him so many times, 300 times. Some say it was with a rock, some say it was with a sharp rock, or a blunt rock, whatever it was a horrible death. I don't know if he's a psychopath, but it's a long story, but it was definitely a terrible thing to do. definitely evil. Now listen to this. Would you ask Chava, ask the mother, would you like your son to die this way? Of course, we don't want him to die at all. Of course not. Certainly not in a horrific way. Listen to this. We don't look for these things, but when a person has a difficulty in their lives, that purifies their neshama, purifies their soul. It makes them better than they were before. 25 generations went by, and the soul of that boy, of Abel, of Hevel, came back as a great man, one of the greatest men who ever lived. His name was Moshe Rabbeinu Moses. The sources that we have say, had that soul not gone through such intense suffering and purification from a terrible death, it would never have been able to reach the incredible levels it reached, and it would never have been able to become who we call Moshe Rabbeinu, the person who brought down the Torah and was the conduit of divine wisdom into the world. So 1 second. So after the fact, you see, even though you never choose this, that terrible nega, that terrible pain that was from 25 generations before, became a tremendous oneg. All of the wisdom that we have today from Torah is all through that one moment and that one soul. It's a very big deal. Okay? All the best, ladies. Feel good.